Hello and welcome to Connotation Points Video Snark. I'm making my way through Stalking Jack the Ripper by Kerri Maniscalco. If you haven't seen the other videos about the book, please make sure that you do or else you might be confused. Links will be posted below. Chapter 3, Tea and Autopsies, Wadsworth Residence, Belgrave Square, 31st of August, 1888. We meet Audrey's father as she tries to leave to wherever she's going. I can't quite decide if the text wants us to view him more as an overbearing donkey or if it's just trying to go for more of a nervous Nellie. Audrey says that she promised Uncle that she would go to him for tea and that turning him down would have been rude. Audrey's brother, Nathaniel, shows up and makes jokes about how dour everybody seems to be. He also jokes about the father's obsessive need to control Audrey's movements and says that she's not dead yet. The book then goes on to give some background to Nathaniel. He's apparently quite flighty and flits from one hobby to the next. Though, as heir to our family's legacy, he didn't need to learn a trade at all. It was merely something to pass idle hours and afternoons besides drinking with his pompous friends. Psst! Hey, Arthur, did you know that, rich lords and ladies don't just sit around all day and play cards? They had actual jobs, you know. They needed to look after the people who lived in the villages that they oversaw. They often sat on councils and boards and such, like for the local hospital or the school. So, much like how you chide your own child for not doing anything but sitting in the basement playing World of Warcraft when he's 30, Audrey's parents would not be encouraging Nathaniel to sit around and drink the family money away, nor would they encourage his flighty hobby behavior. Do people even still play World of Warcraft anymore? Whatever, I don't care. Your dress is exceptional for today's weather and special occasion. 17 now, right? You're stunning, birthday girl. Don't you agree, Father? Oh, good, she's 17! Nathaniel mentions that Uncle had invited him to tea as well, but he has his studies and all that. He also mentions that Audrey is dressed in a fancy dress, but that it's also apparently her birthday. After a short break in which Audrey describes what she's wearing, her father eventually consents to let her go, so long as she goes for tea and then comes right back, and doesn't do any of that nasty business that Uncle is involved in. And it's not that I hate descriptions in books. They can be important to help set the mood and tone of whatever's happening. But my problem is that half of the books that I've been reading will literally interrupt the flow of the story. No, not just interrupt it, but bring it to a screeching halt to describe what a character is wearing. And the description of Audrey's dress is right on the edge of being okay. Did we need to hear what her dress actually looked like? No. Nathaniel could have just said that she was in a nice dress and left it at that. Audrey could have mentioned that her gloves hid her sweaty hands, but despite how short that the description was, it still brought the actual plot to a standstill to describe both dress and gloves. Oh, but then Mr. Father isn't quite done with Audrey just yet. He then turns to Nathaniel and says that he'll hold Nathaniel responsible if anything happens to Audrey. I knew he'd light a cigar soon and lock himself away until morning, thoughts and memories of Mother plaguing him until he fell into a troubled sleep. The book doesn't get points for trying to make me weepy and sympathetic. We were introduced to Mr. Father just a page earlier, and this is literally the first mention that the mother is dead. I just don't care at this point. Nathaniel fusses about his appearance for a moment to establish that he's a fop. Audrey asks him if he'd like to have a picnic lunch with her in the park in the morning. He says that it will have to be next week. I worry about you seeing all that blood. Can't be good for your fragile, womanly temperament. Right, because a woman has never seen blood before in her life. Oh, where in a medical dictionary does it say a woman cannot handle such things? What is a man's soul made of that a woman's is not? I teased. I had no idea my innards were composed of cotton and kittens, while yours are filled with steel and steam-driven parts. She isn't wrong, but I feel like this is leaning towards that aforementioned 21st century line of thinking that's distinctly out of place in the 19th century. Father will go berserk if he discovers what you're really doing. I fear his grasp on reality is most delicate these days. His delusions are becoming worrisome. A seemingly dead mother and an emotionally absent father. With only the kind of awful uncle to care about Audrey, this leaves her to do all the things she'll do throughout the novel. Things I predict should have been left to an actual adult. Last time Father got his way, he'd made me wear a facial mask each time I left the house to avoid breathing contagions. While I'd like to fancy myself above things such as vanity, I'd hated the stares I'd received when venturing out. Okay, except that there's vanity, and then there's being made to wear something so ridiculous. Audrey gets to her uncle's lab where she finds her uncle explaining the wounds in greater detail to Thomas. Audrey takes a moment to muse over what kind of a person the victim might have been, but those thoughts quickly tumble her down a what-if rabbit hole. Audrey goes over to put the liver she'd pulled out from the cadaver into one of the shelves, and then, what tiny little amount of plot movement that had been happening comes to a screeching halt while Audrey looks around the room, starting naturally by describing what the victim had been wearing. She watches as Thomas takes notes while Uncle describes things, until the author seemingly remembers that there's more to be done than to have Audrey standing around. Uncle notices her, seemingly for the first time, and silently invites her to join. As she puts on her apron and walks closer, she turns off her emotions so that she can study the body. The book then spends about half a page describing the various condition of the body, and I get that this is some sort of young adult murder mystery series going on here, but this is also coming off of Audrey bringing the story to a halt so that she could describe her dress and gloves, and then to describe the dress and boots of the victim, so forgive me if I care a little bit less than I normally do. Uncle starts to do an autopsy. Audrey acts as a nurse and hands him the equipment and then drops each piece into jars of alcohol when he's finished with it. Thomas takes notes about whatever Uncle says, although it's mainly just typical medical info like the weight of the liver. And then, book. You'd been doing so well, nearly an entire page of relevant info. Audrey then pauses the plot yet again to muse about things that have little importance to anything. She thinks about her aunt and one of her cousins and how they keep trying to socialize her with girls Audrey's own age, except that they're kind of treating Audrey like she's a dog or something, that there's no way she could possibly be able to communicate with other girls of her choosing. After a while, Uncle starts to stitch the victim back up. Thomas draws the body, and Audrey admits that he is good and that his drawing will help them later. Uncle then tells Audrey that the lady once worked in her family's home. Which, why does Uncle know this, but Audrey doesn't remember the lady at all? Uncle mentions that it must have been when Audrey was sick. But enough of that, let's get back to the murder, shall we? And for once, I'm not angry at the sudden topic change. Uncle asks either of them for further theories. Audrey says that it seems like the murderer has some medical knowledge, and that he likely took the victim somewhere else in order to have time to work on her. After musing for a moment about all the other young ladies who work in her family's home and bringing the story to yet another standstill, Audrey proposes that the murderer likely took the victim to a place like a slaughterhouse where a large amount of blood wouldn't be noticed. Thomas scoffs over the idea and says that the murderer probably worked on her near the river where the water could just wash it away. He backs this up by saying that there's mud on her boots. Audrey is just upset that she missed that connection. However, upon immediately stating that, Thomas then makes a low blow and indicates that Audrey is only there to find a husband. You know an awful lot about how this murderer thinks, I said sweetly. Perhaps we should investigate your whereabouts that evening, Mr. Cresswell. She ain't wrong. Thomas's behavior has been raising alarms in my mind since he was introduced. He then makes another low blow about Audrey's appearance before stating that the press has been calling this murderer Leather Apron. He goes on to say that he thinks that this is the beginning of a killing spree. On that cheerful note, the chapter finally comes to a close. And overall, it wasn't a bad chapter, but my main problem is that there was more stopping and starting of the plot than the freeway during rush hour. It's tedious to read and makes for frustrating reading. I can overlook a lot in a book, but unnecessarily stopping the plot over and over for no actual reason is not something that I can forgive. The chapter ends with a random photo of the Princess Ella circa 1880s. Why? I haven't the foggiest. Chapter 4. A Dance with the Devil. Wadsworth Residence, Belgrave Square, 7th of September, 1888. Some time passes. Panic begins to set in amongst the people as word of the serial killer starts to get out, except that prostitutes need to work, so they don't really change anything. My father was worse than ever, coming unhinged, it seemed, every time I left the house. I still don't care about her father's strange behavior, and the book hasn't made any actual attempts to get me to care. But her father's unhealthy, obsessive behavior also means that Audrey can barely leave the house to go to her uncle's and forget about actually attending his classes. I've never heard of a career murderer before. Probably because the first one lived in America. Jack the Ripper was just the first one to create a media frenzy. Between my desire for Uncle's approval and my connection to Miss Nichols, I was determined to help solve this case. She can't want to solve the murder because murder is horrible. She has to solve it because the lady once worked for her family. And what's worse is that she's also doing it for approval. Talk about doing the right thing for the wrong reason. And then Audrey goes on to tell me something that I actually do care about. She came down with scarlet fever, and while she was caring for her sick daughter, the mother's previously weakened heart couldn't take it and she died. As you might imagine, Audrey carries a lot of that guilt with her. Nathaniel tries to say that none of it was Audrey's fault, but she says he doesn't know how it feels because he wasn't the one sick. God had failed me. I had prayed and prayed the way Mother always said I should, and for what? Death still claimed her in the end. It was then I knew I'd rely on something more tangible than Holy Spirits. Science never abandoned me the way religion had that night. The thing is, I actually do care about this. The problem is that the author tried to shoehorn in the details about the dad being upset and obsessive over germs and where Audrey was going without giving us any reason why we should care up until now. Audrey is restless one night and feels bad because she hasn't solved the first murder, so she decides to do what every protagonist in a young adult book would do. She puts on her clothes and goes out to try and find clues. In the middle of the night, with a serial killer on the loose, who murders young women who walk the streets at night. Didn't I say something about awful decision-making abilities, or was that another book? Whatever, this is happening. And despite all of this, Audrey can't help but bring the story to a brief but annoying stop just so that she can describe her dress. The paleness of my already sallow-looking skin was heavily contrasted by the black clothing, so I pinched my cheeks, giving them some much-needed color. She's going out to try and find a serial killer, but better make sure that she looks good first. Good grief. She briefly thinks that her uncle and Thomas were out the night of the murder. My uncle was not capable of such acts. Thomas, however, I couldn't say for sure, but refused to follow that trail of thought. Look, I've had a weird feeling about Thomas since he was first introduced, not just as a love interest, but also that he's going to turn out to be Jack the Ripper, and if he's not, then it'll be a weird red herring. Audrey, however, thinks that the killer is some traveling physician, somebody who maybe was paid dearly by a rich person for an organ transplant, although at this time a transplant has yet to be done successfully, which is something that the book throws in. She then sneaks from the house, thrilled over the idea of doing something so delightfully naughty and against her father's wishes. I couldn't take the carriage without father learning of my shameful activities, and trekking through the cobblestone streets for nearly an hour wasn't as bold and daring as I'd imagined it to be. I was cold, and the streets stank of wine. Your dream job versus the boring reality of the job. Audrey walks around for a while, and it's only when she's hiding from some drunks that she stopped to question her behavior. She's doing this to thumb her nose at Thomas mostly. Her common sense flew out the window because of an annoying boy. She keeps feeling like somebody's watching her, and at one point she hears something behind her, but there's nobody there at all. She goes to a nearby pub, which is filled with both butchers and factory workers. As she's stepping inside, somebody grabs her from behind and puts a hand over her mouth. The unnamed person, although we all know who it is, says that he's going to take her somewhere so that they can talk. Audrey elbows him in the stomach, but finds that wearing a skirt is probably a bad choice as she tries and fails to run off. However, as we all frickin' guessed, it's only just Thomas, because of course it is. She asks why he's out so late, and he's quick to turn the question back to her, and then Nathaniel shows up too. Please spare me any of your ridiculous stories, sister, Nathaniel whispers harshly when we were far enough away. I don't even want to know why you thought it a fine idea to trapeze around darkened streets while a murderer is stalking women. Do you have some sort of a death wish? Oh look! Common sense in a young adult novel! It's rare enough that I do actually have to comment on it. I also wanted to scold him for being as overprotective as father and reacting hysterically. I feel like there's the insane overprotection that their father is doing, and then there's Nathaniel literally finding his sister creeping about in the middle of the night while a killer is on the loose. They are not the same thing. He chews her out and uses their dead mother to put enough guilt into Audrey to make her consider twice before she does anything like that again. And it actually works. For now, at least. There isn't a doubt in my mind that Audrey's going to go slinking off into the night again before the end of the book. Nathaniel goes on to say that he and Thomas, along with several other young men, have taken upon themselves to patrol the streets at night in search of suspicious persons. Mr. Cresswell will see that you make it home safely. Right. Nathaniel is just so concerned over Audrey's safety that he can't even be bothered to take her home. Instead, he asked Thomas to do it. And since this is a young adult book, I know that this is going to be an opportunity for them to bond over something or another. Audrey naturally protests, but then both Nathaniel and Thomas insist. Thomas has to literally drag her to the carriage. And with that, the chapter comes to a close. And there isn't a random photo between chapters 4 and 5 either. I'm honestly kind of disappointed, really. Now, I know that I keep bringing up that one Goodreads review about how Audrey has the fixings of a 21st century girl, but is in the end of the 19th century. But it's true. She's a strong, independent woman who don't need a man, in a time before women had the right to vote. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't write about strong women even when you're writing historical fiction, but the problem is that a woman's strength looked a lot different in the 19th century. Thanks for listening to my book Snark on YouTube. If you're enjoying this, please hit that subscribe button. I post a new video Snark every Monday, but if you're eager for more Snark, you can check out my review of The Plan. If you've already seen that, then you can head over to Tumblr for my main book Snarks, and if all of that is somehow still not enough for you, then you can become a patron supporter for just $1 a month and read a bunch of bonus Snarks that isn't up anywhere else. See you next week, guys!